Welcome to the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast. I'm Jeremiah Regan.
And I'm Juan. We're back with American Citizenship and Its Decline. We are on to lecture number 5 today, The Rise of Tribal Politics. And if you remember last time, we talked about illegal immigration and the complications with illegal immigration, the difficulty of assimilating into a culture, and why we need to temper immigration into a country so that a people maintain some sort of cohesion. And if that doesn't happen, you can see why we get into tribal politics.
So what is meant by tribal politics, Juan?
So tribal politics is the idea that you have these different competing tribes, essentially groups of people that sort of have things in common with themselves, but not in common with the whole. And so those different tribes start having tensions with each other.
Is this like the factions that Madison talks about in the Federalist Papers?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what Madison is talking about.
Because on one hand, we do want similarities between people. In fact, a people, the thing that comprises a nation, should have things in common, should have special loyalties that differentiate it from other peoples. But what Hanson is talking about, what we mean by tribalism, are divisions within a people, breaking it up, making it so it's not a people, not a nation.
Right. And, we hear a lot the refrain nowadays, diversity is our strength. And I think that idea is going to be very much challenged here. Of course, depends on what you mean by diversity.
James Wilson, one of the founders, talked about diversity in intellect, diversity in interests. And he's talking about the normal human differences, like some people like making podcasts, some people like making online courses, some people like making useful things like farming implements. That kind of diversity is good, but there's other diversity that's not good.
Right. We all need to have the same view of justice, and if you start having diversity there, then you have a problem.
Yeah, you have to agree on certain fundamental things. If you're enjoying this course and you want to learn more, make sure you check out the online courses blog. You can find that at hillsdale.edu/course. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Or if you're already on the online courses website, you'll see the link to the blog. We post articles that explore concepts discussed in our courses. We always tie it back to something that our professors talk about, but it helps us to expand on the topics there.
Now let's turn to Dr. Victor Davis Hanson in lecture number 5, The Rise of Tribal Politics.
Another challenge to the idea of citizenship in a constitutional society is one of tribalism. And it's probably the most ancient and dangerous of all the challenges of citizenship. Remember what tribalism is. It comes from a Latin word, tribus. It just means three. And to the Romans of the classical period, they looked back at their own ancestry and they said, there were 3 separate ethnic groups that fought with each other before they were incorporated into the body politic of the Roman Republic. And we don't like that, and therefore it was called tribus, and it became our word tribal. But what it means in the modern English language is that a person identifies more with somebody who superficially looks like they do than another person that doesn't. Or to distill that even more simply, race or your ethnic pedigree become essential to who you are rather than incidental as an American. Most of what we know from history, the philosophers, the political scientists, starting with Thucydides, considered tribalism a threat to civilized society. So when you read the history of the Peloponnesian War or Herodotus' history or Tacitus' Germania, the message again and again is tribal people are incapable of creating a settled, prosperous society because the principles of meritocracy, that choosing somebody to hold office or to be a judge or to be a magistrate will not be decided on their skills, but on their tribal or ethnic associations with someone else. If you wanted to be stereotypical in examining modern societies, any society that puts a higher premium on a blood tie than a person's skill set. In other words, many countries in the Middle East today, if you're a first cousin, you will be hired over somebody who's a complete stranger, regardless of the respective qualifications for the job. And you can see how that's injurious to a state at large. And so The problem with tribalism versus citizenship is when a society never develops the idea of a citizen, or citizenship reverts back to its primordial state of tribalism, we have two injurious effects. One is that meritocracy starts to disappear and we start appointing people to jobs or admissions by their superficial appearance. And the second is birds of a feather, as Plato said, who was the original author of that aphorism, birds of a feather flock together. So people do not form friendships or business relationships based on commonalities of ideas or shared traditions or common interests, but more on the superficial affinities of their appearance, their race or ethnic qualities. In the United States, originally, remember that the 13 colonies were founded by Europeans from the British Isles. And immediately, as the United States grew beyond the 13 colonies, there were two great challenges to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and that meant all men are created equal. But what if there is an indigenous population within the United States, Native Americans, who in many cases don't want to give up their land, and yet they don't have the technology or the numbers to resist the intrusion of the settler population, and some states bring in people from Africa or the Caribbean, and they do not give them full rights or any rights at all. They're slaves. And how can you incorporate those people in, given the ideals of the Declaration? So those were decades, century-long processes to give the full protection of the Bill of Rights to people who did not look like the original founders. That challenge was multiplied because people started coming in as legal and illegal immigrants increasingly by the late 19th and early 20th century, not necessarily from countries where people look like the majority population in the United States. And people being people, flawed individuals, then they tended to discriminate, or they held prejudices against people that didn't like them. But the saving grace of the United States was citizenship. The idea that to be an American means to embrace the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, national holidays, the civic customs and traditions, the heroes, all of that bundle that's involved in becoming an America is not predicated on race. Race is an instinctual and elemental, a backward idea. But citizenship is a modern liberal concept. And so much of the story of the United States was evolving beyond tribalism. And we did pretty well. By that, I mean, what do I mean by pretty well? Well, if you're an American today and you go to Mexico and you're not of Latin American ancestry, you're going to have a hard time ever being accepted in Mexican society if you want to be a citizen of Mexico. Take a liberal democracy, Japan. If I, Victor Hanson, decide I love Japan, I want to be a Japanese citizen, I immigrate to Japan in a country that's about 98% Japanese, I don't think I'll ever be fully accepted as Japanese. If I want to go to an autocratic society, take China of 1.5 billion people, and I say to the Chinese, I'm Muslim and I'm of Swedish ancestry, or I'm an atheist, or I'm African ancestry, but I love China. I want to be part of your body politic. I want to be a citizen of China. First of all, they don't have a concept of citizenship, of a free, autonomous individual who has rights and responsibilities that are protected under a constitution. But nevertheless, in a monoracial society, you will not be accepted fully as Chinese, even if you were able to have legal parity. The same, to a lesser extent, is true of Europe. Europe is a Western society. It draws on the same intellectual and philosophical traditions as the United States. And now within the European Union, all states are constitutional republics or democracies, parliamentary systems. And yet Europe has not had the same multiracial experience and founding documents and founding ideas as the United States. So they have a very difficult time in the late 20th and early 21st century of incorporating, assimilating, and integrating people who don't look like the original European. So if you look at the United States as I speak, we had an African-American president, Barack Obama, for 8 years. We currently have the first woman and the first African-American vice president, Kamala Harris. We had 2 successful secretaries of state, Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice, that were African-American. That would be very hard to emulate in Europe today. So what I'm getting at is that the idea of a multiracial society under constitutional auspices where people surrender their innate ethnic or racial identity, and in place of it, they absorb or they receive a shared idea of citizenship, an abstraction, an idea, is very rare. It's very rare in the existing world. It's very rare in the past. Some of you are going to say, well, wait a minute, there were countries, nations, empires that were multiracial. Look at Rome by the 3rd century AD. And yes, indeed, there were North Africans, there were Dalmatians, there were Balkans, Spaniards, French, but they were united under Roman auspices through the use of force, Roman legions. So if they wanted to break away and form their autonomous group, they were forced by the Roman army to stay within the confines of the Roman Empire. And there was an effort at the same time to offer Roman law, Roman technology, a Roman standard of living to people who did not look Italian. So by the imperial period, there was a true multiracial society, very rare. If you look at the Ottoman Empire, run out of Istanbul, it was a multiracial society, but it depended on an autocratic, coercive system. If you look at the Soviet Union, the republics of the Soviet Union, there were many different races and ethnic peoples, but it depended on the coercive efforts of the Communist Party to force people to be Soviets first and their particular ethnic groups second. If you look at the former Yugoslavia, it was a conglomeration of very disparate ethnic groups and religion, but it required the coercive power of the Communist Party. If you look at Rwanda, the same is true. And what happens? They all fail. Today, Yugoslavia is separated into ethnic enclaves. Rwanda had a Holocaust that involved probably 1 million dead Hutus or Tutsis as they descended into racial pre-civilizational violence. So can you think of any country in the United Nations that today is a multiracial, successful democracy or constitutional republic? Maybe we could say India is, but India has a caste system. It has terrible religious strife between Hindus and Muslims. It has ethnic violence. Maybe Brazil is trying, but it's an imperfect democracy. There's periods of autocracy. There's endemic prejudice and institutionalized racism. It's really only in the United States, historically, in the present, and hopefully for the future, that we took on this very bizarre idea, this very fragile idea, this very delicate idea that we were going to have millions of people who were going to live together under one common allegiance to the idea of the Constitution, where race would be incidental, not essential to who we are. And this was the dream, remember, of the civil rights movement. Martin Luther King Jr. said, I want to make sure that the content of our character and not the color of our skin is what matters in America. It was going to be a racially blind society, and people bought into that. So integration, assimilation, intermarriage were the desired outcomes of Americans, so that we might look at any different color, any different appearance, but it didn't really matter. It would be incidental. And yet here we are in 2021 as we get more and more ethnic groups immigrating and people are starting to re-tribalize, that the very idea of a citizen where race or ethnic background is irrelevant, or at least not as important to their status as being America, it's come back. And it's come back with a vengeance. It's come back so much that Martin Luther King Jr. is no longer a revered icon of the civil rights movement. It's more Black Lives Matter. The idea that being black or being Hispanic or being non-white or being another group other than the majority gives you special rights, special considerations, special affinities, and this in some cases can trump your allegiance as an American. In other words, you look back at the Constitution and you look back at 19th century American history, you look back at the Civil War, and you don't see a rare effort, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, flawed as it was, but it's an effort to get to the point where we were in the 21st century, where we were of all different races. So how did this happen? How did we start to re-tribalize? I think part of it came out of the 60s, that in the eagerness to create parity, groups that were extremists said, you know what, it's not enough to be equal because we were unequal for all these years, so we have to be more than equal. I think most Americans were willing under the Johnson administration to say, okay, we'll have a period of 10, 20, 30, 40 years of institutionalized prejudice. And we won't call it that. We won't call it quotas. We'll call it affirmative action. So if somebody is not of the majority ancestry, i.e. white, then we will give extra consideration given the idea of past bias or maybe the fumes of present bias. And we were all accepting of that. But as the so-called white population started to, in proportional terms, decline a little bit, and more groups decided that they were victimized, then the number of people with complaints against the majority grew. I think it's often underappreciated that during the Obama administration, specifically 2009 to 2016, a radical concept emerged that really threatened the very foundations of U.S. citizenship. And this was the idea of diversity. Remember that affirmative action had been focused and targeted on the idea of the historical sin of slavery, and the idea that because people looked African, they were not fully American. In the United States, during the Civil War, the efforts to stop Jim Crow, the civil rights movement was trying to erase that blemish from its history. But under the idea of diversity, other groups that were not African American, not the 12% of the population, but other groups that were, quote, not white, were suddenly aggregated. And so the number of people that had claims on the majority for past grievances were anybody that was not white. And think what that entailed. You could immigrate from the Punjab and you could sell your farm for $200,000 an acre and be quite wealthy, arrive in California, and suddenly you were diverse. You would never experience discrimination in the United States, but you were diverse. Why were you diverse? For one reason. You were not white. At least you could claim you were not white. You could come from South America. You could be a Chilean aristocrat. You could come from Brazil. You could be a doctor from Nigeria. And all of a sudden, whatever your particular ethnic heritage was, you were beyond the old binary that white America was trying to come to grips with the prejudice shown and discrimination institutionalized against Native American people and black people. And so diversity said 30 to 33% of the population now doesn't feel part of America because we feel as non-white people that whiteness was toxic.
Do you believe in our founders' vision for America? That our republic will only survive if we are an educated and informed people who know our rights and duties? Since 1844, Hillsdale College has sought to educate all who wish to learn about these timeless principles of self-government. For more than 50 years, the college has worked to spread that mission by sending Imprimis to millions of Americans. Imprimis features some of the best speeches given at Hillsdale events, and now an audio version of the popular Speech Digest is available in a new podcast of the same name. And, like the print publication, Imprimis, the podcast, is always free. Listen to the best arguments from speakers such as Chris Rufo, Molly Hemingway, Mark Stein, and Hillsdale College President Larry Arnn, read by Hillsdale students. Subscribe today to listen to Imprimis at podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you get your audio.
Okay. Notice what it does. It destroys entirely the concept of class. Remember what Marx said, the story of history is a binary. It's one of oppressors fighting oppressed, the exploiters fighting the exploited, the victimizers warring against the victimized. And it's all based on money and class and privilege. But when you apply that to the United States, it never really worked. Not with a huge middle class that was the basis of citizenship, not with the idea that race in the Constitution is not mentioned. It would be incidental, not essential to Americans. Not anything. But all of a sudden, when you change class considerations and you say class doesn't matter and class is no longer synonymous with race, we could say maybe in the early 20th century still, or the 19th century, people who were not white or recent immigrants or the descendants of slaves economically faced greater obstacles. But today, for example, the highest income group by ethnic ancestry are Asian Americans. If you look at the fastest income gains of the last 20 years, they occur in Asian Americans and Hispanic Americans. And so what I'm getting at is race and class are not the same. And yet we're supposed to look at race now as victimizers. And so all of these anomalies appear. We're in this Orwellian world where Oprah Winfrey, from a $90 million home in Montecito, is talking to Meghan Markle from a $15 million home in Santa Barbara nearby. And what are they talking about? All of the injustice and the oppressions they've suffered as people with African American ancestry. But their very status belies that fact. Or we have LeBron James, who's worth $1 billion, who tweets and he goes onto Facebook and says how unfair the United States is and how discriminatory it is. But remember, class and race are not identical anymore. And so I'm speaking from Hillsdale, Michigan, and when I ride my bike, I see some of the poorest people that I've ever seen in rural Michigan. They happen to be white. It's indifferent to me. But where I live, there are Mexican immigrants that are far wealthier in California. And yet we're going back to a tribal identification that has nothing to do, in many cases, with victimization. And we're saying if you can posit a tribal identification, then the state or the government or the people owe you something. And this is headed for disaster. We know that from history that tribalism inevitably will end up like the former Yugoslavia or the strife we saw in Iraq or Rwanda. There's also some practical problems with replacing citizenship by tribal identities. And the first is, how far do you want to go with making race more important? We're looking at the U.S. military now. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said that one of his chief obligations is to root out white anger or white supremacy. Secretary of Defense, General Austin, said, I'm going through the rosters of American enlisted men to make sure we don't have white supremacy. He didn't say, well, I'm going through it to make sure we don't have radical Antifa members or BLM members. It was just a focus. So what he is basically saying is that we're going to look at our military now in terms of whiteness, and we're going to have re-education programs, and we're going to read Professor Ibram Kendi's lectures on racism, in which he says, to cure racism, you must be racist. To cure discrimination, you must practice discrimination. And here's the problem with that. If you're putting all of your emphases as ancient tribes, the Goths, the Huns, the Osgoths, the Vandals, on your tribal identity, what are you not doing? You're not building civilization as they did not do. And so while our military is focused on categorizing us by race and ethnic background, we've just surrendered and lost in Kabul in the most catastrophic, humiliating defeat in American history of the last 50 years. So if a CEO of Delta or a CEO of American wants to virtue signal in this new climate of wokeness and says, I have to weigh in the Texas voting law, because if you have to produce an ID to vote, or you're in Georgia and you have to produce an ID, that is discriminatory. But what are they not doing? They're not doing what they should do, and that is ensure their planes are on time, ensure their planes have fuel to take off. Secretary of Defense, General Austin, said, we want a military that looks like America. I think he meant that in terms of colonels, 1-star, 2-star, 3-star, generals should be 12% African American, 10% Latino, 6%, 8% Asian, the rest white, or 10% of mixed heritage. And so we're going to apply this tribal mindset to every category. Or are we? Are we really going to do that? If you look at the dead in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you look at it by class and race, about 73 to 75% of those who died in Iraq were from the white middle class, and the same is true of Afghanistan. But according to the new diversity tribal mentality, we would say, well, wait a minute. There's 70% so-called white people in the United States. Half of them are males. It's 35. We've exceeded our quota of dead people. So we're fighting in Afghanistan. We have to say, wait a minute. You Marines that are guarding the Kabul aircraft, we've got to pull you back in because you've already met your quota of dead. So other people come up of different races, you get on the front lines and you've got to die for the next 6 weeks because you're disproportionately escaping your responsibility as a tribalist. And that's where it goes. There's also other things that happen when you want to emphasize DNA rather than the content of your character. How do you do that in a multiracial society? One of the things that we all notice in academia is that some students and high school students that want to go to what they feel are elite colleges, and they feel that they have an ethnic cachet, 1/16 Native American, 1/4 Mexican American, they will take a DNA test to show you that they're actually not white. And think of that for a second. Ostensibly, nobody would know what you are. So how could you be a victim if nobody knew what your ethnic identity was, because it wasn't superficially perceivable? So you have to take the effort to re-tribalize yourself so that you can then say that you are part of the 30% that has historical grievances against the majority culture, and those should be rectified by special consideration and admissions. In its most egregious or laughable case, we see Elizabeth Warren wants to appeal as some kind of victim, and she says she's part Cherokee. There's no evidence that she ever was. She's blonde, very pink-looking. So she takes a DNA test to show us, and all it does is show us that she's not. And Ward Churchill is the same thing, Rachel Dolezal. We have these high-profile cases of people who say they live in a racialized society, a prejudicial society, a discriminatory society, and yet they're making great efforts to prove that they're not part of the majority population, which makes no sense. When the United States was definably racist, as I think it was in the late 19th century and early 20th century and all the way to the Civil Rights Movement, people did just the opposite. If they were not white, they tried to act as if they were white for the privileges that accrued under a discriminatory system. Now that just the opposite is true, so how can it still be racist? Then we get into the problem that we don't apply this across the board. Take the NBA, 74% African American, NFL, 73%. In other words, these are meritocratic institutions. We pick people to go into the NBA or the NFL or Major League Baseball on the basis of their athletic talents, their hard work, their industry. And we don't really care how they look. And this was a great improvement, advance over the old tribal system, and it was tribal, where only white people in the 1920s, 1930s, early 1940s until Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. And what was the result of that? Baseball, basketball, football, they became much more dynamic games as we allowed players to participate based on a meritocratic rather than a tribal criterion. They were full citizens of the United States, in other words, and they followed a meritocratic system where tribalism was irrelevant. And now here we are, that people who have benefited from that system, like LeBron James, are lecturing us that it's not a fair system. But according to the logic of tribalism, the retrograde reactionary pre-civilizational logic, someone could say to LeBron James, well, wait a minute. There's not very many Asian Americans. They make up 6 to 7% of the population. They don't appear in the NBA or the NFL. And look at Latinos. I don't see very many Latino basketball players. And yet we know they play very well because the National Olympic team in Spain or Brazil are excellent. So why don't you have a mentoring program? Why don't you have a quota system? And so once you go down that road that you're going to organize society by tribalism, then immediately these problems arise. And that is, who is a tribalist and who can prove that they have a particular ethnic identity, and when do we not use that ethnic identity to replace meritocratic considerations? And when you look at the United States, this very rare, fragile, multiracial society, and we start to re-tribalize, then the first casualty are going to be meritocratic occupations. If United Airlines says for their pilot training program, they're going to have a quota that 50% of their applicants will look a particular way, not people who are just applying racially blind and by test scores or former pilot training or military experience, the ultimate result will be that you're going to put people in a cockpit that have less experience or less aptitude, not because of their particular race, but because you're using race in lieu of meritocracy, and that's going to endanger the people in the plane. And when you layer that again and again throughout a very complex society, you're going to see something quite opposite of the United States. The United States is the wealthiest, most productive, best educated system in the world. We have the greatest agricultural output, the greatest energy output. We have 17 of the top-rated 20 universities in the world. We have the best technology because it's a meritocratic system. It does not appoint professors or give grants for scientific research on the basis of race. In other words, the United States works on the basis of racially blind citizenship, that we all give up our racial and ethnic identities. We leave them back in our past, and we accept an American melting pot, not a salad bowl, not a wokeness, but the melting pot. And we give up something of ourselves for the greater gift of becoming American.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Hillsdale Online Courses podcast. If you want to continue learning about the virtue of citizenship or other topics, please visit hillsdale.edu/course. There you will find over 40 free online courses, including Constitution 101, The Real American Founding, American Citizenship and Its Decline, and many more. The courses include additional readings, study guides, fully produced videos, and you can chat with your fellow students on a dedicated forum. Upon completing a course, you will also get a certificate. All our courses are free because we believe that a virtuous citizen is the best defense for liberty. So pursue the education necessary for freedom and happiness at hillsdale.edu/course today. That's hillsdale.edu/course. Thanks for listening.